This is Stigma, where we talk with leaders from many industries about how mental health and addiction have impacted their lives. Many people suffer silently from mental illness, addiction, depression, anxiety, and trauma. They never seek help because of stigma. In this podcast, host Stephen Hayes and his guests share their stories of recovery in order to encourage others to do the same. Here's Stephen.
Welcome back to another episode of the Stigma Podcast. I am your host, Stephen Hayes, and today I'm having a conversation with Ronan Levy. He's the founder and executive chairman of Field Trip Health. Ronan was an early pioneer in the medical cannabis industry, and he's going to talk a little bit about that. He launched the world's first integrated company in legal psychedelics called Field Trip Health, which is what we're going to focus on today. Field Trip currently has operations in North America, the Caribbean, and Europe, where their goal is to really be the leader in medical and therapeutic applications of psychedelics, which is what we're going to focus our time on today. So I've been really excited to share this with you, share this conversation and some of the learnings that Ronan has pointed me to around the psychedelic space. So without further ado, Ronan, thank you, man, for making time for us and for coming on today.
It's my absolute pleasure, Stephen.
So I want to have you kind of walk through Field Trip and what you guys are up to. But I think a good place to start would just be with a little bio background and kind of how you found your way to being in the psychedelic space, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a million things I could point to, at least different decision points and things that bumped along my path that led me here. But I'll give you the somewhat expedited version, which was back in 2013, started a business, but I was doing legal work, kind of freelance to help pay the bills because the business wasn't generating enough cash. And through that work, I ended up meeting some entrepreneurs who were actively looking at a new opportunity in various businesses, but one of them included the cannabis space. And they were a little bit reticent to get into the cannabis space because of appropriately stigma. They were concerned that, notwithstanding the regulatory changes in Canada, which made everything entirely legal and legitimate, is still going to look negatively upon. And I did not share those concerns, not because I was an active cannabis user. I'm not, never have been. I'm certainly not opposed to it, but I didn't see any issue with it. I'm a big fan of Tom Robbins, who says at a certain point in life, you got to decide between what is right and what is merely legal. That makes you metaphysically on the run. America is full of metaphysical outlaws. And so, I looked at that and I was like, listen, I mean, even if it was of questionable legality, it's like morally, I have no opposition to people using cannabis. If, consenting adults can do what they want as long as they're not hurting other people. And so, I also thought this was a massive opportunity from an entrepreneurial perspective and an economic perspective. So I kind of pushed the guys saying like, hey guys, we should do this. And if you're not going to do it, I'm going to do it because it's too good of an opportunity to pass up. So after cajoling them for a bit and talking about it further, they agreed to look into it further. And then we kind of joined forces. And through those efforts, we started a company called Canvas RX and a sister company called Canadian Cannabis Clinics. Canadian Cannabis Clinics has grown to become the largest network of cannabis specialized medical clinics in Canada. There are 30 locations. We've helped over probably 150,000 Canadians access the legal medical cannabis system in Canada. And Canvas RX, which was the technology platform kind of underlying the clinics business, we sold to Aurora Cannabis and joined them in 2018 and helped them grow, or 2016, and helped them grow into one of the largest producers globally of cannabis. During that time, I went in fully agnostic as to the therapeutic potential of cannabis. I wasn't convinced that there wasn't any use, but I wasn't convinced that it was as medical as people conveyed. At the end of the day, from a philosophical perspective, I didn't really care that much because I felt what we were doing was right, regardless of the medical applications. But what we saw through our clinics was just how profoundly therapeutic cannabis can be for people. Almost uniformly, all of the physicians who worked in our clinics, which were very hard to recruit initially, have described cannabis as the single most effective therapeutic agent that they've ever used for their patients. We had patients literally crying because they'd come to us and it was like, the cannabis did nothing for my back pain, but God, I slept for the first time through the night last night in 20 years, and that's made all the difference. So we just saw just how impactful it could be, and it really changed our mind and our attitudes towards stigmatized medicine. So after we left Aurora in 2018, following the sale of the business, we were looking for something new to do. And we were looking at a number of different opportunities. But that's when, through a random meeting, we learned about what was happening with psychedelics and what was happening with compass pathways. And Michael Pollan had just published How to Change Your Mind. And I naturally, just like the opportunity with cannabis, where it's like, guys, we got to do this. I had that same feeling with psychedelics, just knowing that this was going to be huge and impactful. So we dug into looking into psychedelics, researched it for about 9 months. Really trying to figure out how to formulate a business model in an industry where most of the molecules are still very much illegal and scheduled, and then kind of coalesced around a plan and formally incorporated Field Trip in April 2019. And the rest, I guess, is kind of history.
No, that's awesome. One of the things I read in the company's mission statement, I think I read it on your LinkedIn profile, is that the mission is to heal the sick and better the well through psychedelic medicine and therapies. And as somebody that's in recovery from addiction, as somebody like myself managing bipolar disorder, when I hear you say things like heal the sick, that gets me excited. How is healing possible? How does psychedelics help us get to a place that traditional existing drugs can't do for us?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to sort of flip back into my bio for a second to explain where I'm coming from on that. But even though I've never had a clinical diagnosis of depression or anxiety, although I'm sure at certain points in my life, particularly during my articling years as a lawyer, I was probably clinically depressed. I've never really experienced any sort of severe mental health crises, but all along, for the last at least 15 years, I've worked with different coaches and different therapists because I realized that emotional processing, that going deep and inward and dealing with the traumas that every human experiences is really important to living the best life you possibly can, to being the best partner or the best parent, or just being as happy as you can. If you get deep into the underlying drivers of what causes you to do what you do, what drives, the shame that makes you think you're not worthy, all of these kind of things that we don't really talk about, to be quite honest, these days in modern kind of medicine, because they're a little too soft and hard to define and not terribly objective, but realize that there's significant potency in addressing these issues. And so what's believed to happen with psychedelics and how they can actually heal people. And I say that not just from an opinion perspective, but if you look at some of the clinical trials, like the MAPS trial that's looking at the use of MDMA for PTSD, they are actually showing total resolution of all symptoms of PTSD in people in 70% of people with chronic severe PTSD. So you're talking about a real cure, not just masking the symptoms, not just making them feel better by helping the symptoms go away, but fundamentally eliminating the PTSD. So we're talking actual real cures. We're really healing people. And the way it works, or the way it's thought to work, because it is still kind of unknown, the mysteries of the brain and human neurology are well beyond our total understanding at this point. But the way it's thought to work is twofold. One is psychedelics, as well as ketamine, which is what we're using in our Field Trip Health centers, provide a natural, pretty immediate antidepressant effect. So even if you have depression or anxiety or any of these conditions, most people report a very significant improvement in mood immediately following the use of the psychedelic. So you have the natural antidepressant effect, much like some of the other antidepressant drugs out there. But what's unique about psychedelics is that they also create a period of well, I guess there's two things. One is when you're on a psychedelic trip, people very often report reliving or experiencing emotions or events or anything along those lines with some degree of detachment or objectivity. So they can actually go into the feelings and emotions around them, so they can start to process them and start the actual emotional healing of those particular instances. And then secondly, following a trip, people typically have a period of neural plasticity, where literally the circuitry of your brain is more adept and responsive to change and the influence of cognitive behavioral therapy. And so between those dynamics of having the antidepressant lift, having that emotional processing often start happening during the trip, and with the cognitive behavioral therapy that can really, I guess, accelerate the emotional processing, as well as really drive habit, outlook, perspective, lifestyle change, so that your changed attitude can also become changed lifestyle. Like it goes from just being starting new habits to being ingrained in how you live your life. all of these factors lead to fundamental changes in not only emotions, but also in your neurology and your brain circuitry. And so that's currently the thinking as to why psychedelics can be so effective, is because it's not just making you feel better, it's helping you get at the underlying drivers of those mental health conditions, cure them, process them, heal them, and then open you up to actually making real lifestyle changes that will continue to support that healing.
So with CBT, I mean, I go see a therapist and my therapist and I talk, and a lot of times we try to resolve past trauma. Resolving that past trauma is one of the keys for me dealing with my mental illness and dealing with, staying sober and dealing with addiction. And the way I understand it is that by being on a trip, I remove some of my ego. I remove some of the blockers that society and that I've put in place that prevent me from turning and facing myself and dealing with my trauma. So it makes my therapy more effective. Is that a safe layman's way to say what's going on in these psychedelic assisted psychotherapy sessions?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, when you talk about some of the science around psychedelics, you'll hear people talk about the default mode network, which are kind of an interconnected part of the brain that's really thought of as the operating system. It's the thing that's doing all the work when you're not consciously thinking about stuff. And what they've shown is that during a trip, the default mode network kind of quiets down. It stops running on full gear. And it's also believed, and they've kind of done some work with functional magnetic resonance imaging that shows that like the ego from a psychological perspective lives in the default mode network. So when you're on a trip and afterwards, the default mode network and the ego is kind of quieted. So it can't put up those barriers because your ego, I'm not a psychologist, so I'm just speaking what I've learned from the work I've done, is kind of what keeps your sense of self-identity. It's what sort of identifies the borders of who you are and how you perceive yourself. And when you can take that down, you can take down those borders, you can take down those walls, and can actually get into the machinery of how you define yourself and fundamentally change that. My coach talks about how one of the biggest challenges with obesity, for example, is that people can lose weight, but if they don't fundamentally change their self-image and see themselves as not being obese anymore, they'll always gravitate back towards that lifestyle. So you need to actually change your self-image as part of this work. And when the default mode network and the ego is kind of quieted and tempered, you can actually create that changing perspective of yourself and your attitudes towards yourself, your self-love. All of that becomes much more possible during that window.
That's a great explanation. Thank you for that. One of the things I want to pull out of you here is a little bit more of an understanding of exactly what Field Trip does. The way I understand the business, there's really kind of two key components. One is a series of health centers where you provide therapy and dosing, and you provide psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And then the other part of the business is sort of drug development and discovery. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, I'd actually say there's a third component as well, which is Field Trip Digital, which is we're doing a lot of work to really drive the conversation into the mainstream. So we've got our own podcast, Field Tripping, Epic Trips and Psychedelics, just trying to have people talk and share their experience with psychedelics, because there's a lot of healing and shared growth that can happen when people talk about their experiences. And what happened in my experience may actually resonate with you and your experience and may accelerate and help your healing as well. So we have the podcast. We've also launched the Trip app, which is really designed for people who are doing any kind of consciousness expanding efforts, whether that's through meditation, breath work, legal products, or natural supplements. Anyone who's doing it kind of on a less clinical basis, more for expansive purposes. We think there's a lot of people out there, especially as the conversation around psychedelics goes mainstream, that people will start working with these kind of modalities, but without the necessary support. Trip is not designed to be a replacement for a doctor or a therapist or a psychologist by any stretch of the imagination. It's really designed for those people who are, engaging in consciousness expanding activities legally, on an expansive basis, as opposed to treating a mental illness basis. So that's Field Trip Digital. Field Trip Discovery is our drug development arm, which is focused on advancing drug development on next generation psychedelic molecules. Our first molecule, FT104, is currently in preclinical development, but it's really exciting because we think the indication that it works well for and the path to market is actually quite efficient. So we think it'll be one of the first next generation molecules to get approval. It's still a long time away, 5 or 6 years away, but that's the primary focus of Field Trip Discovery. It's not the only focus though. The other focus is we fully expect that the emergence of the industry is going to look in some ways very similar to cannabis, where there's going to be a purely medical component to it, but there will also be a very healthy wellness component to it, where people will be able to access psychedelic therapies without necessarily having a clinical diagnosis. And we see that happening actually potentially in the state of Oregon as soon as this year, actually on the November 2020 election. And so you're going to see probably a market for psilocybin producing mushrooms as well as synthetic forms of psilocybin emerge. And if you do see a market for psilocybin producing mushrooms, bringing our lens from the cannabis industry, we want to be at the forefront of cultivation because we know it's not as easy to go from underground cultivation to commercial, legally compliant, analytically tested cultivation. And so we're kind of doing the legwork now to be prepared to support that kind of opportunity in the future. And we're doing that at the University of West Indies in Jamaica, anticipating that we'll see markets emerge fairly shortly for psilocybin producing mushrooms. And then the third piece, as you noted, is our field trip health centers, which really is based on the belief and the opportunity that when it comes to psychedelic therapies, existing clinical infrastructure is not going to do the trick. This is not something that your family physician can support, especially when you consider that the average psychedelic experience can be anywhere from an hour to 10 hours. And while psychiatrists are certainly equipped to provide this kind of care, they don't necessarily have the physical infrastructure or the human resources staffing to provide this kind of care, at least at scale. So in order for the psychedelic industry really to emerge, you need new clinical infrastructure, much like we saw in the cannabis industry. And so that's what we're trying to build with field trip health centers, is really building that clinical infrastructure. So when, with ketamine now, but with that MDMA or psilocybin, as soon as they get legalized or approved over the next few years, we'll be in position to start delivering that care as quickly as we can.
What is the landscape like there with legalization or removal from Schedule 1 for some of these medications? Is it something that's going to happen soon? Is it something that may or may not happen? Like how do you handicap the removal from the schedule process?
I'm 100% convinced it's going to happen, at least for psilocybin and MDMA. The time frame for that is anywhere from 6 months to 5 years, I think, is the kind of time frame. But I'm quite certain it's going to happen. And the paths through which that will happen, there's a few different options. Certainly, FDA approval is one of them. The MAPS trial looking at MDMA for PTSD is in phase 3, and MAPS is on record saying that they expect to have their approvals in place by sometime 2022, 2023. Same kind of course for synthetic psilocybin, which is probably 2025, 2026. And that's being led by Compass Pathways and a nonprofit named USONA. So I think that's a very likely path. It just may not be the first to get across the line. The two other channels through which I think this will happen are in the US, much like we saw with cannabis. You're going to see a lot of grassroots political efforts in this regard. I know for a fact that the people who were very actively involved in the cannabis grassroots efforts are already working on psilocybin legalization and on state-by-state basis. Right now, the polling shows that the ballot initiative in Oregon will succeed. And then I know California had an initiative as well as Colorado. Those were shut down because of the pandemic, but almost certainly they're going to have much more momentum in 2022 for the next US election. So you can see other states coming online with legal markets for psilocybin through that channel. And then in Canada, we don't have the ballot initiative path, but we do have a very activist and interventionist judiciary. In fact, medical cannabis came around in Canada in 2001 by court decision, not political action or political activism. A court decided that the criminal prohibition on access to cannabis for therapeutic purposes was a violation of what's called Section 7 of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And when you look in the facts and circumstances around that case, in terms of the evidence for the use of cannabis as well as its safety profile, and you look at the safety profile and efficacy for psilocybin, it's almost impossible to come to a place that a Canadian court that decided that cannabis was okay will decide that psilocybin is not okay. So it's really a question of which one gets across the line first. In Canada, we had a pretty significant evolution actually in the last couple of weeks where the Minister of Health granted 4 exemptions to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act to end-of-life patients who wanted to access psilocybin for end-of-life distress. So that's it's a small wedge, but it's a massive opportunity because what's going to happen is you're going to have tons and tons more people submitting similar applications, either for end of life or other mental health conditions, and they want access to psilocybin. And it's going to be hard for the minister to justify why one person over here can do it, another person over there can't do it, at least in a way that the court system in Canada is going to find satisfactory. So you're probably going to see an expedited path to some legal market in Canada as a result of the exemptions that the Minister of Health just granted. But as with any court process, the timeframes around that are a little bit uncertain. My hope, as naive as it may be, is that politicians will actually do the right thing and get proactive about this as opposed to reactive about this. But, it's probably more of a pipe dream than anything, but you never know.
You mentioned efficacy, and earlier you had talked about a 70% number around PTSD. What are some of the stats from the research around how effective these treatments are versus either doing nothing or just CBT or CBT with SSRIs? Is there a place where we can point folks to learn more about that?
Yeah, there's a study expected to be released soon. It was being done at Imperial College in the UK that actually has pitted psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy against conventional antidepressants in a randomized controlled trial. And when that comes out, from the whispers that we've heard, it's going to show quite persuasively very strong evidence of the use of psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, at least. There are a number of studies out there. It's hard to point to any individual one. Certainly the results out of the MAPS phase 2 trial, which you can find on the MAPS website, which I think is maps.org, that's quoted there. There was a study that came out in the last couple of months from New York University where 5 years ago, patients were given psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy for end-of-life distress. And of the patients who are still alive, a significant number of them are still reporting the antidepressant effects of that psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy session. So you're looking at, effects lasting up to 5 years for psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. So those are the kind of two more significant recent studies. I know Professor David Nutt, who's also at Imperial College, just released a great article in Cell, the journal Cell, last month or two, kind of giving an overview of the evidence and the history around it. So that would also be a great article, but I don't remember exactly what the website or the domain is for that.
That's okay. We'll track it down and we'll link it in the show notes along with the things that you just mentioned. And this isn't new, right? I mean, it isn't like we just figured this out a couple years ago and we're like, oh my gosh, we should go do something about this. We've known the effectiveness of these compounds since the 50s, 60s, 70s. Am I right? So why is it just now becoming a conversation that we could use this to help people?
Yeah, no, a lot of this evidence has existed since the 60s and 70s. Now, certainly, I think clinical research techniques back then and now are probably substantially different. So I think what's driving this conversation now is an intersection of a few convergent trends, which is certainly mental health has gone mainstream. Mental health and well-being has gone mainstream. We see that with, apps like Headspace and Calm becoming valued at north of $1 billion. So meditation, emotional awareness, it's become a much more mainstream conversation. That's been part of it. The research has picked up in earnest again over the last 10 or 15 years through the work at Johns Hopkins and NYU and Imperial College. Researchers have picked up where the kind of 60s and 70s were forced to leave off and advanced the research since then. And those results are showing those studies are showing incredible results. I think also the changing attitudes towards cannabis are helping people revisit once stigmatized medicines and giving them another shake. I think, the opioid crisis has certainly done a lot to damage the trust and reputation in big pharma. Whether that's deserved or not is another question, but I think it's truth that a lot of people have become very skeptical of the current industrial complex around pharmaceuticals. So people are looking for sort of more historic, natural alternatives. Not that LSD or MDMA are natural; they're not, but they still get bucketed into plant-based medicine for whatever reason. And so I think all of these things are having an impact as to why psychedelics are having a moment right now.
One of the things I like to think about is how the early cannabis industry compares to where we are now in the early psychedelic industry. How would you draw the comparisons and what kind of contrast would you draw between the path that the cannabis industry took and the path that we're on in the psychedelic space?
I think the biggest difference is that the renaissance around psychedelics is really being primarily driven by academic and clinical research. It's the data that's showing the work. With the cannabis industry is much more, there was some evidence and there still is some evidence, but the evidence around psychedelics is much more persuasive than it had. The evidence around psychedelics is much more persuasive than it ever has been for cannabis, even to this day. So I think it just makes it a less divisive conversation, right? You can't argue about stats. You can't argue about facts. You can argue about, whether people actually think cannabis is effective or not, or safe or not, if there's no data. But if there's data, it's kind of generally irrefutable. And that's made the conversation a lot easier. So I think that's one of the big differences between psychedelics and cannabis. In terms of how the industry emerges, I think it's also going to be quite different, which is cannabis is much more of a product-focused market, which is you go, you buy a product, you use it like you use most drugs. Obviously it's different because you're either taking it as an edible or inhaling it or anything along those lines. So it doesn't quite fit, but really you're doing it by yourself at home, and that's how it works. With psychedelics, it's much more of a service-based approach. When it comes to the outcomes around psychedelic therapies, it's not only the drug that matters, it's the choice of set and setting, it's the choice of therapeutic protocol that surrounds the psychedelic trip. And so, you need much more active involvement from participants. It's not a thing you can do at home as easily, so to speak, as you can with cannabis. And so that's, I think, a big difference. And that's really the emphasis we've put into how we've built our field trip health centers. We've focused on building a setting that is quite welcoming, warm, safe. You walk into it and, anyone who wants to see pictures of our clinics, they can be able to visit them at fieldtriphealth.com. But we've really built a space that feels warm, comfortable, safe, very naturalistic. We have moss walls in the clinics because that set and setting really matters. So people need to feel comfortable and at home to have the best therapeutic outcomes. And we've invested heavily in terms of building our protocols for the patients. We didn't accept anything as taken for granted. We really worked with a number of experts from across a number of different fields to develop our protocols, which we think are unique and differentiated because we started, assuming nothing and building from the ground up based on input from a lot of different experts. And so, that's the difference around cannabis and psychedelics as well, which is psychedelics are much more about an experience where cannabis is about a product.
For our listeners that are hearing this and they're thinking, man, I'd like to try this out. Maybe this could help me. How do they find you? Where do you have clinics today? And how do people connect to maybe come in and find out if this kind of treatment's for them or not?
Yeah, so we have clinics in Toronto, New York, and LA presently. We'll be opening one in Chicago, and we hope to scale to many more clinics over the next few years. But those are the first 4 that'll be open. And if they want to learn more, the best place to start is our website, fieldtriphealth.com. Currently, our clinics are only treating people with mental health conditions. So you have to have a diagnosis of depression or anxiety or PTSD or anorexia. They're not available for people who just want to kind of do more exploratory therapeutic work like I've done in my life. It's mostly a function of current regulations. We expect that to change pretty soon and attitudes to liberalize. But right now, we're just focused on treating people with diagnoses of mental health conditions. And so, if you're interested, please give us a call. We will need access to some of your medical records so we can validate the diagnosis and understand what other medications you may be working with, because certainly there are some contraindications where ketamine-assisted psychotherapy is not appropriate for everybody, even if you do have a mental health diagnosis. And that would be the path. We're focused on making sure that our team is very easy to get in touch with and thoughtful in providing information. Some locations will require a referral from an overseeing physician. Some won't. Again, it's jurisdiction by jurisdiction specific. If you wanted to come to our Toronto clinic, which is where I'm situated right now, you would need a referral. But in LA and New York, you won't need a referral, but we will still need access to your medical records just to make sure it's safe and appropriate for you to try ketamine-assisted psychotherapy.
I mean, for someone like myself, I have a bipolar diagnosis. Do I qualify?
On a preliminary basis, yes. If you've tried conventional treatments and they haven't succeeded, then you meet the initial requirements. Now, what the other contraindications are and what may determine that you're not a suitable patient, it's outside of my realm of knowledge or understanding.
No, I totally get that. That wasn't really like a doctor question. It was more just like there's a listener out there that's sitting there thinking, hey, I'm like this guy. Could I go? And so I just kind of wanted to float that out there for them.
Yeah, the truth is like if you're not certain, give us a call. There's no harm. I mean, I this is like a broader like commentary on life, but like if you don't know, ask the question. There's no harm in asking a question. What's the expression? It's better to remain silent and look stupid than open your mouth and remove all doubt. But no, that's not the truth at all. The truth is like if you're not certain, ask questions. There's no stupid questions when it comes to us. This is a very new area. We're dealing in mental health. We obviously place the dignity of all the people who get in touch with us as the highest priority, because the last thing we want to do is make anyone feel at all self-conscious, at all ashamed. That's exactly what we're trying to undo through our work. So please reach out and ask any questions that you may have.
One more question for you, and this is a little more long-term thinking, but we talked about what it can be used to treat now and what you are treating now. Where do you think it goes? What do you think psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, what do you think these treatments can be used to treat in the long run?
Yeah, I mean, the capacity for psychedelics is it's so fascinating. So mental health conditions like depression and anxiety, etc., are the low hanging fruit because that's where the research is. But there's now research looking into the use of psychedelics for conditions like Alzheimer's and inflammatory conditions, because most psychedelic molecules, in addition to being potent mental health treatments, are also anti-inflammatory, which undoubtedly actually accelerates their use as a mental health treatment as well. But they could be used potentially across the board. I know Shlomi Raz, who's the CEO of a company called Eleusis, talks about how in indigenous cultures, peyote was not only used in terms of spiritual and shamanic settings, they would actually apply it to wounds and injuries because it was an anti-inflammatory and could minimize, healing times and all that kind of stuff. So I think you're going to see a lot of interest in psychedelic applications to many more physical health conditions and not just mental health conditions. But also, there's a growing body of evidence of the expansive properties of psychedelics in terms of their ability to enhance creativity and enhance empathy, enhance general well-being. So, in my view, psychedelics are going to fundamentally displace almost all current practices of psychiatry. They're just that much more effective. And I think, in 20, 30 years hence, we're going to look back at what we were doing up to 2020 with psychiatry and consider it as barbaric as, using leeches or bleeding people as a treatment, although leeches are back in vogue for a number of different reasons. But also, I think, there's going to be a really strong emphasis on broader use of psychedelics in controlled settings for people who just want to improve the quality of their lives, deal with their traumas and lead a happier, healthier lives. And I think the applications of that are going to be incredible because we live in such a technically and digitally isolated society these days where, people can't have conversations anymore, especially when it comes to politics. They're just based in opinion and not logic, no reason or anything along those lines. There's too much judgment these days, not enough discretion. And I think psychedelics, really can open people's minds to seeing the world in a different way. I know, the first time I tried a larger dose of psychedelics, one of the things I had was like an appreciation for how people on the right side of the political spectrum view the world, even though typically I would fall on the left side of the political spectrum. That just gave me an awareness and an empathy, being like, oh, that may be the motivation for why they take opinions the way they do or take positions the way they do. And I think, that kind of olive branch to just see the world from someone else's perspective is such a powerful tool. I go back to, it's one of the core operating principles for me now is Tom Robbins has this wonderful quote, and I wish everybody would live by it. He says, "There's no such thing as a weird person. Some people just require more understanding." And if you can put yourself in that consideration, and anytime you're dealing with someone who's obnoxious or rude or mean or controlling, and just ask yourself, what did that person go through to end up like this? Gives you a lot of compassion, it gives you a lot of understanding. Instead of reacting from anger, or lashing out, you can stop and take a deep breath and be like, yeah, this is a nuisance. This is not okay. But instead of getting angry at the person, I'm going to get frustrated with the circumstance and I'm going to deal with the circumstance as opposed to, taking it out on an individual. And I think if everyone can get there, and I certainly think that psychedelics are an amazing platform for people to start seeing the world in a much more conscious way like that. And so I think that's the future of the industry, is broad-based application for a number of people to help their emotional and spiritual growth.
I think it could be a big tool for stigma reduction. I mean, I think it could be really big for our mission.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. For sure. On both levels, which is, I think it can help a lot of people. They often experience stigma for reasons of some aspect of who they are, whether it's a mental health condition, skin color, anything along those lines, things that are outside of their control. But if they can start to heal the shame and trauma and hurt and emotions underlying that, then they're not going to be affected by the stigma as much anymore. And if people who are causing the stigma, looking negatively upon those things, can have more compassion and understanding, you're going to stop the stigma as well. So I think it's a virtuous cycle for sure.
Well, look, man, I appreciate you doing this. Is there something I should have asked? Is there something I missed that the audience should know about Field Trip or about this industry?
No, I mean, I just think people should just read about it, understand it, look what's going on, read the scientific papers, speak to people, because I really do think that, I think in the 1960s, people thought psychedelics are going to fix the world. And I think that might have been naively informed. But I do genuinely believe that psychedelics are a platform to start to address many of the challenges and social ills that we're experiencing as a society right now, and on so many levels. It's not going to fix everything, never going to say that, but I think it can be the wedge to start fixing a lot of the things that I think we as a society need to start tackling. And that's why I'm so excited about it. That's why when I think about my opportunities in life to do something really impactful and significant, like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or Richard Branson, it's like, this is the opportunity, because the level of impact that I think we can create through Field Trip and the psychedelic industry more broadly is going to be on par with some of the most significant changes that we've experienced as a society over the last 100 years and beyond.
Yeah, I agree with you, man. That's why I'm on board with it. That's why we're getting involved in the space and investing there. So I'm with you 100%. I'm grateful that we get to work together, and I'm really appreciative of your time to come on and speak to our audience and educate them on psychedelics, educate them on your business, and educate them on where this industry is going. So thank you so much for making time. I really appreciate it.
It's my sincere pleasure. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. It's great to have you aboard. Your enthusiasm and commitment is really touching and inspiring. So it's great to be having this conversation, being able to work with you for sure, Stephen.
Ronan, thank you, man. That's so kind of you and generous of you to say. And like I said, I'm just really grateful to get to be a part of the journey. And I think a lot of people are going to get a lot out of what you shared here today. It's really informational. I think this is going to be a great resource for people who want to know more about what's going on in this space. So thank you. To our listeners, thank you for being here. And please, if you like our content, please hook us up with a subscribe or a like or a review on your podcast platform of choice, and share us with a friend as well, if you don't mind. If you'd like to support us and the content we create, then you can find us on Patreon as well. That's going to be linked in the show notes. To the founders out there, don't forget to join the Mental Health Startup Slack community, which you can also find a link to in the show notes. Additionally, at What If Ventures, we recently launched what we are calling the What If Fellowship, which is an 8-week program to facilitate accelerated business development for those building companies in the mental health space. We would love to have you check it out through the link in the show notes. And if you think we can help you get your idea to market faster, then please let us know. And most importantly, we just want to hear from you. We want to know what you liked, what you didn't like, what you agree with, disagree with. Please do comment on social media and let us know what you want to hear more of. You can reach us on Twitter at StigmaCast. You can reach us on Instagram at StigmaPodcast. You can email us info@stigmapodcast.com. And you can find us on our website, stigmapodcast.com. Thank you so much for being here. That's it. Until next time, stay safe, be well. And thank you so much for your support.